Redemption doesn't arrive with the fanfare of trumpets. It arrives with clarity. Not the clarity of victory, but the clarity of identity. The moment a people no longer define themselves by pressure, threat, or expectation. The moment exile ends isn't when the world changes. It's when Israel does. This is the redemption phase, the final movement of what some call the Fifth Exile. It's the moment where the story stops being about mere survival and becomes about profound purpose. To understand redemption, you first have to understand what exile truly is. Exile isn't just physical displacement. It's a state of disorientation, a condition where identity becomes reactive, fragile, and dependent on the world's approval or disapproval. The Fifth Exile was never just about land. It was about legitimacy, a relentless global debate over Israel's very right to exist, to define itself, to stand without asking for permission. But redemption is the collapse of that debate. Not because the world finally resolves it, but because Israel simply stops participating in it. And this brings us to the first truth of redemption. Exile ends when identity becomes sovereign. Not just politically sovereign, but spiritually and internally sovereign. Unshakably sovereign. Redemption begins when Israel no longer asks the world, "Do you accept us?" and instead declares with quiet confidence, "We accept who we are." This shift isn't loud. It's not dramatic or cinematic. It is an internal, psychological, and covenantal transformation. Jewish tradition often describes redemption not as a sudden, flashy miracle, but as a process of maturation, a people finally growing into the identity they were always meant to carry, a nation remembering its origin story, a purpose rediscovered. This is the second truth of redemption. Redemption is not an event, it is a realization. It's the profound realization that Israel's existence is not conditional. It is not negotiable. It is not dependent on a global consensus. The world may resist this. It may deny it. It may even intensify its pressure. But pressure loses its power the moment identity stabilizes. Because exile is sustained by confusion, and redemption is born from clarity. Clarity about covenant. Clarity about purpose. Clarity about destiny. This clarity isn't arrogance. It's alignment. A return to the center after generations of being pushed to the very edges. And that leads us to the third truth. Redemption is irreversible. Once identity is reclaimed, exile cannot return. Once purpose is remembered, confusion cannot dominate. Once sovereignty is internalized, legitimacy can no longer be revoked by others. Redemption isn't fragile. It is final. But it doesn't look like triumph in the way we often imagine. It looks like steadiness. It looks like a nation that no longer flinches under scrutiny. A people who no longer feel the need to constantly explain themselves. A covenant that no longer apologizes for its own existence. This is the redemption phase. The moment after the long transition. The moment where external pressure becomes irrelevant, and the very meaning of exile dissolves. Why? Because Israel is no longer being shaped by the world's ever-shifting expectations. It is being shaped by its own enduring purpose. The world may not recognize this moment. History books may not record it with a specific date. Other nations may not acknowledge it. But redemption doesn't need recognition. It needs conviction. And this is the final truth. Redemption is not the end of exile. It is the beginning of destiny. Destiny doesn't wait for applause. It doesn't seek permission. It certainly doesn't negotiate its own existence. Destiny simply walks forward. Quietly, clearly, unshakably. This is the redemption phase. The final chapter of the Fifth Exile. The moment where history stops being a heavy burden and becomes a platform, not for survival, but for revelation. Not for defense, but for purpose. Not for legitimacy, but for legacy. The Fifth Exile is over, and redemption has begun. Thanks for watching.